Hello, this is Ben and welcome to Hickham's Dictum. So for this video, we're going to answer the question, what is documentation? And then embark on a journey to discover how to establish a culture of documentation in your company, your business, your organization, or your team, okay? I'm going to be speaking from my experience, sharing some best practices with you. Again, we're going to answer what is documentation, answer why documentation is important, go over some reasons why companies are not able to build cultures of documentation, go over some types of documentation, and wrap up with the meat of the matter, how to establish a culture of documentation. Okay, so sit tight and let's have fun exploring this really important topic that can really add value to your bottom line. Let's go. So, first question, what is documentation? What is documentation? We use documentation every single day, right? When you go purchase a new TV or a new phone or a new device, it usually comes with a manual with some documents of how to use and operate that device, right? If you're going to a new experience, whether it's at an amusement park or you're reading a newspaper that gives you a historical reference or historical account of what happened at some moment in the past or what is set to happen in the future, that is documentation. You go to a meeting and you take notes in the meeting of what was discussed to share with your team members. That's all documentation. So what is documentation? What is documentation? Documentation, I like to think of documentation under four themes, right? It's a compass, right? It sets the direction for an end user, right? It gives you a goal to shoot for and the steps to accomplish that goal, no matter what that goal is. It is a series of steps to accomplish that goal, right? Think of process. It is a useful reference, right? So if I want to come back and reference, have a source reference for something that happened in the past and so forth, or how to do something, is a reference. And finally, documentation is a written account of an idea. Very important. It's in writing and it's an account of an idea or a concept, okay? So it sets the direction, it's a compass, it's a series of steps to accomplish a goal or how to do something. It is a useful reference, a good reference point, and it is a written account of an idea. Very important, it's in writing. So we answer the question, what is documentation? But why is documentation important? Why is it important to have your processes or goals or projects or whatever the case may be documented? Why is that important? Well, there are a couple of reasons. The first thing is that it promotes efficiency, right? When we have things in writing and documented and we have a record of events and things that are going on, it promotes efficiency and it promotes big picture thinking, right? Another reason why documentation is important is that it reduces risk. It reduces risk. If you have a team member who is a key player on your team and that team member leaves, for example, if you have documentation on what they've been doing, on their processes, the technology they've used and so forth, it helps mitigate that risk. It helps reduce the learning curve for anyone else who takes their place. And it also promotes transparency, which leads to my third point. It reduces training time and it also reduces costs, right? The time you might have to hire somebody new to learn a new process from scratch, if you have documentation in place, you can eliminate those costs significantly. It promotes efficiency and so forth. Having a culture of documentation also facilitates process improvement, right? If you have your analysts who have a culture where people are constantly reviewing processes and the ways of doing things, there's always room to improve. There's an auditing culture that evolves. We're constantly optimizing how we do things. You see a constant evolution, right? And you can always tell the companies that have been doing the same thing for years versus the companies who keep on reviewing how they do things and keep on evolving. So it facilitates process improvement. It supports business verticals, right? So if we're looking for, in line with what I just said, if we're looking for gaps in our process, gap analysis, a documentation culture can help. If we have a written account of how something is done, why something is done, and so forth, whether it's a project, an initiative, we can look through those detailed accounts, step-by-step accounts, and find gaps that can translate to other business verticals, right? Another reason why having a culture of documentation is important is that it develops authority, right? If you have your analysts and give them ownership of their processes and what they do, they feel empowered. They can now contribute from a leadership perspective to your processes and so forth. So it empowers people, right? Documentation empowers people. Another very common reason why documentation is important is that it promotes transparency and promotes collaboration, right? You don't have documentation helps break down silos and helps stop bad practices like information hoarding, people holding on to information and they don't want to share what they've done across the company. When you make it a standard that we document everything we do, there's more transparency, the information flows freely, and so forth. And the last reason I can give you for why documentation is important is that it standardizes systems. And by that I mean, naming conventions might differ across systems, not because of any need for that to be that way, but because people just don't talk to each other and just don't understand what each other does. So you might find, when you have a culture of documentation, you find that there are a lot of unique keys or variables between systems, and we can start to standardize naming conventions, standardize processes, so we have less confusion and more streamlining, which leads to, again, increased efficiency and ultimately translates to a positive impact on the bottom line. So these are a few reasons why having a culture of documentation is very, very important. So what are some reasons why some organizations or companies do not have cultures of documentations, or maybe they've tried and they don't know how to establish cultures of documentation, right? So it takes discipline and strong leadership to build a culture of documentation. You need very proactive leadership and management to set the stage and actively push analysts and stakeholders to document their processes or document systems and so on and so forth, right? It takes really strong leadership. So some reasons why some companies don't have cultures of documentation could be just that reason, right? Leadership, or maybe even bureaucracy, right? There are too many layers, a lot of politics. So, you have so many layers and silos that it becomes hard and almost impossible to embark on documentation initiatives, right? Another one could be just, lack of experience, right? You don't have people who have the right skills or the right experience who've documented before. So it's not that they're not smart people, they just don't know what to do, right? So they've never been in that culture before, so it's foreign to them. So again, lack of experience, lack of skills, lack of understanding how to put things in a template, whether it's for process documentation or systems documentation, database documentation, and so forth. They just don't have the experience and know what to do. Another reason why some companies may not have a culture of documentation is simply just a lack of the attitude, right? You just don't have a proactive attitude in your culture, right? People are waiting for other people to get the job done. So you have this kind of lazy, or should I say, lack of no motivation, no proactive attitude. You just get things done and think of process improvement and so forth. So again, lack of a proactive nature can lead to no documentation. And the last one I can think of, which is more on the negative attitude side, and again, this is just my opinion, is more on the negative politics, when it comes to information hoarding. You see this a lot in big companies with a lot of teams and silo teams and so forth. People holding on to information. They don't want to share what they do or how they do things and so forth. That can lead to lack of a culture of documentation. And that can cause serious impacts, big picture thinking on the bottom line. So these are a few reasons why companies and organizations don't have cultures of documentation. The purpose of this video is to show you how to build a culture of documentation. So, what are some of the traits of good documentation, right? We created a good document. What tells you that a document has been well prepared, right? Let's go over some of the traits of good documentation, right? So the first thing I can think of is that good documentation informs users and enables users to perform a task. That is perhaps the main goal of most documentation. It informs users and enables them, the stakeholders, to perform a task. Clear instructions. Crafted documentation addresses the right audience, right? There's a specific audience for every project. If I'm doing a database project on documentation and so forth, I may not necessarily share my database documentation efforts with necessarily, not always the case, but I may not necessarily share with someone who is in a graphic design space, right? Of course, there are exceptions to that. Not everything's mutually exclusive, but you get where I'm going, right? You have to address the right audience. If we're speaking with software developers, your documentation has to speak to them. If it's documentation for reporting analysts and so forth, your documentation has to speak to them. If it's a campaign development document, more of a business focused sort of thing for, that you give with account managers and those sorts of people, it has to speak to them. So your document has to speak to the right audience. Another trait of good documentation is it gets to the point, right? No fluffy words, no vague words, no passive words, active language, right? So no maybes or maybe we should do this or it could be, no words like could or would or maybe. Documentation has to have active language throughout, right? Gets to the point and addresses what needs to be done or what ideas are being formulated, right? Another trait of good documentation is that it provides context, right? It gives you background information on what needs to happen or what's going on or why a project was initiated or the variables affecting a project. It provides context, right? So good documentation, if I have a document, I not only know what to do, but I know why I'm doing it, right? So it provides context. Another trait of good documentation is it has good visuals, right? With different kinds of learners, some people like text and some people like visuals. It's always good to have visuals so people can see what is being referred to, right? If it's a process document, visuals with screenshots pointing to what is being talked about. If it's a database thing, good entity relationship diagrams that show the flow of data. If it's a web design thing with user experience, good wireframes or screenshots that show, the different modules that are being enhanced. It has to have good visuals. So good documentation has visuals. Another trait of good documentation that is that it is well vetted, right? What I mean by that is that it's been reviewed. You don't just have one person slap a document together and then accept that as the golden truth. It has to be reviewed by, all the stakeholders involved, right? So it has to pass. It has to pass a series of tests. It has to be easy to understand, so that any of the stakeholders can get what's being communicated. Like I said, active language, and it has to be well vetted. It has to be reviewed. Other things in good documentation is it has to have the author's name, right? So the reason why I say that is pretty self-explanatory. If a question comes up in the future about the document that's being discussed, we have to know who created it and how to reach them, right? So if it's one person, their name has to be there. If it's a couple of people that came up with that project, their names, plural, have to be there. So we know who to contact, who to ask questions and so forth, right? So it's not a vague, we're not running around in circles trying to figure out who did what. It has to have a date, right? And the reason why it has to have a date is very important because, especially with technology, technology gets updated frequently, right? Technology changes by the hour, minute, day, month, and so forth. So a process that might be in place today may change a month or two from now. So we have to have the date there on the document to know if that document needs to be updated, with what cadence we're updating and so forth. So that's why having a date in your document is very important. And finally, I would say it has to have the tools and skills required for whatever that initiative is, right? If it's a process document, right? Just think about it, right? If you buy a new TV or you buy a new table construction set, it usually lists there the tools required, right? You need a hammer, you need a screwdriver, and so on and so forth, right? If you buy a new construction set or whatever, it tells you, hey, you need to have this skill, knowledge of this, and this. The same applies to business documentation, right? If you're doing a reporting documentation and you're speaking to that audience, hey, you need to have these skills. You need to have SQL skills. You need to have Tableau skills. You need to have, knowledge of, if you're doing web analytics, Omniture, Google Analytics. If you're doing email marketing, you need to know about email databases and CRM terminology and email marketing software like Silverpop and with Epsilon and so forth. If it's you get what I'm trying to say, right? You have to list the skills required so the people who are looking at a document can know, hey, before I have a meeting on this, I need to sharpen my skills in XYZ so I can be qualified to speak in meetings or whatever the case may be on that document. So these are some of the traits of good documentation. So what are the different types of documentation? If you go online, you're going to find a lot of articles with, documentation is this, that, and the other. I've grouped them into four buckets: historical, process, overview, and architecture. Historical, process, overview, and architecture. I'm going to go through each of these examples now. So process documentation is just what it says. It's process. It gives you a series of steps to accomplish a goal or whatever it is you're seeking out to do, right? Good examples. Just go online and Google, YouTube, how to set up a YouTube channel, right? You're going to see documentation there online from YouTube on how to use their software, their tool to make a YouTube channel. You can go on Google Analytics. How do I set up custom dimensions and all those kinds of activities? Google understands the importance of documentation, and they have tons of documents online for users to properly use their products, right? So Google understands the importance of documentation, right? So these are some examples of process documentation. You can also have process documentation internally on your team to create reports, how-tos and so forth that have, good step-by-step, good context, good visuals on how to build reports or how, a process is going to take place and so forth, right? So that's process documentation. The second one of type of documentation I'm going to discuss with you now is historical documentation. So historical documentation, just think about it, right? A newspaper, most of the articles there are historical accounts. They are describing an event that happened at some point in the past or something that is that may happen in the future, right? But most newspaper articles are historical documents, right? They're describing something that happened in the past. From a business perspective, a historical document could be something like, like I said earlier, meeting minutes, meeting summaries. You go to a meeting, it's always good practice when you go to a meeting to take notes on what's being said and share your notes after the meeting and have a standard system or way of doing this, right? Either you have one person who is going to take charge of that role, or if you go to a conference or something, you have a bunch of your teammates after the conference, you get back or whatever the meeting is and exchange your notes and come up with a unified document account of what took place and what actions need to happen moving forward, right? So that's historical documentation. The next one I'll discuss with you will be an overview documentation, right? So overview documentation It's more setting the stage of what this is more of a strategy document. Sets the stage of either a plan of attack, the overview of a business or a product or an initiative and so forth. So an example I can give you from the real world would be, if you go to the army, right? If you think of when military campaigns, they're about to go, launch a strike somewhere or, go on an operation. There's usually an overview document that explains the threats, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the strengths, the lay of the land, the key players, and that sort of thing. So that's an overview document. From a business perspective. It could be, we're launching a new website or a new campaign. These are the target demographics. This is this budget we have. These are the team members that are going to work on this project, and so forth. These are the possible pitfalls, possible weaknesses. More of a big picture thinking document that sets the lay of the land. These are good documents to have if you want to understand a business. If you work in any kind of service industry, it's very important to have these in place for your leaders, your directors and stuff, so they understand the lay of the land from a business perspective and not just a tactical lower level perspective, right? So that's an overview document, right? And the final type of documentation I will discuss here from my perspective will be what I would classify as architecture, right? So these tend to be a bit more technical, right? They give you the specific framework or infrastructure of whether it's a piece of technology or a business model and so forth, right? So when it comes to architecture, I will think of things like if a solution design document commonly used in technology. If you're doing database work, you have things called ERDs that usually complement these kinds of documents that show kind of the different tables and so forth and how they're connected within a database or how different databases are connected. If you're doing web design, it could be a user experience document that shows how the flow of the customer journey will go and that sort of thing. If you're doing, product development, you might have these kinds of technical documents that show the different phases and the different requirements for each stage, whether it's developing a mobile SDK or whatever the case may be. So these tend to be more technical documents. And now, it's a very, very, very important point. All these categories that I came up with, that I described, they're not mutually exclusive, right? You can have documentation that has more than one of these types connected, right? I can have an architecture document that also has an overview component, right? We're doing a technical design, but hey, this is the background of what's going on and so forth. I can have a process document that also has an overview component. In fact, I would recommend when you do most process documents to have a section there that has a background to whatever the report or whatever the case may be, so that analysts know why they're doing that analysis, right? And so forth. Another thing to note is when it comes to, you see this a lot with software development and software lifecycle management, that sort of thing. The type of documentation used usually will be determined by the approach to developing whatever that software or initiative is, right? And there are two very common approaches. There's Agile and there's Waterfall. I'm not going to get into those in this video, but just keep that as an FYI. That usually when you get into the more detailed architectural / technical sorts of requirements, the type of documentation may be affected by the method used in development, right? So that's it for the different types of documentation. Now, there are different types of documentation tools available on the web, and I'm not going to use this video to go into each one of these products. You can Google search them and find them on your own. I'll put a link or name a few in the description to this video below. Just to name a few off the top of my head: GitHub, Dropbox. These guys, these sorts of folks, they are very focused in project management, and they do have documentation solutions. So I will put a link below with some automated documentation resources that you can access as well, just to complement this video. Okay, so we've discussed, gone over answer the question, what is documentation? We've discussed, why documentation is important. We've gone over some of the reasons, at least from my opinion, why some companies don't have cultures of documentation. We've gone over some of the types of documentation. So now let's go into the meat of this video. How do you establish or build a culture of documentation in your organization, your company, your team, whatever the case may be, right? So I'm just going to speak from my experience managing teams and just initiating projects and initiatives and so forth. And I hope this provides value for you. So this is just my experience, right? You might have suggestions of your own. So my experience to date, I have built teams with resources in different parts of the world, actually. And I've also, for companies, I have managed teams both onshore, and by onshore I mean within the United States, and I also have some experience managing or directing teams offshore in countries like India and so forth, right? And each of these has been a tremendous learning experience for me, and I've learned a lot of things. One of them is establishing cultures of documentation. So with establishing a culture of documentation, I would say the first thing will be to set expectations and provide guidance. To set expectations and provide guidance. If documentation is not a focal point, you want to, as a leader, take a proactive step and say, hey, this is what we're going to start doing moving forward. We're going to start documenting all our reports, right? So we mitigate the risk. We're going to start doing this, right? And notice the language I'm using. I'm not using passive language. I'm not saying, oh, we should document our reports. We should do this. Oh, it'll be a nice thing if we document it. No, I'm using active language. We are going to start documenting our reports. We are going to start having resources to transfer knowledge and that sort of thing. So again, this step requires a lot of proactive, firm leadership, and also providing guidance, right? So if this is a team that's never done it before, lead by example, right? So in my case, in some of the teams I've run, I actually create a document for a sample report that we're doing, or if I do an analysis, I actually design the document and then I share with the team. Hey, I put this together for this process documentation. Please use this as a guide or a template, and please build out the documents for all these other reports that fall under this category. So again, set expectations. I expect these things to be documented, and provide guidance. So that's the first step, I would say, in establishing a culture of documentation. So the second step, I would say, in establishing a culture of documentation on your team or within your company and so forth, would be to follow up with your number one step and communicate the importance of having a culture of documentation, right? Follow up. So especially, this is very important, especially if you're dealing with a company or a team where this is not the norm, right? People are creatures of habit. So it's not enough to just say something once, because they're going to revert back to their old ways. So you have to keep on reinforcing what you said the first time, and also communicate why it's important, right? So, either send an email when you have your status meetings, again, bring it up. Hey guys, I just want to bring up again that we have to get on this documentation effort, and then provide the why, right? This is an example. It's very important that we start documenting our processes or reports or whatever the case may be to improve competency and standardize workflows. However you want to phrase it, just make sure you communicate the why so they understand why they're doing things. People will root for you if they know why they're doing things, right? If it's vague, they may not get on board with your plan or your vision. So again, follow up, step 2, and communicate the why behind why we're doing documentation, why we're documenting processes and so forth, right? The next step in establishing a culture of documentation is to collaborate with your team members and review the document, right? This is what separates, hands-on leadership from leaders who just say things and then they step away, right? Your peers will respect you more if you deal hands-on with them. Your subordinates, sorry. So collaborate and review. Once you start receiving documents that your analysts and so forth are putting together, set some time to review it with them. And then remember, early on in this video, I went over the traits of good documentation. You can use that as a checklist to see if these documents meet the required standards, right? So for example, are they easy to understand? Do they have good visuals, good diagrams? Do they capture the right information? Are they addressing the right audience? Is the name of the author on the document? Does the document have good context in it to set the stage for why this initiative is happening in the first place? Are the key stakeholders listed in? Are the skills required listed in this document? So on and so forth, right? Use this time as you review the document to go over these checkpoints, because it's very critical you do this step, because if you hand off a document that is not efficient to the next person in line, for example, if somebody leaves and somebody else joins, and that document is not properly made efficient, you're going to increase the learning curve, which is going to affect your efficiency and affect your profitability. So it's very important to have this review step once the documents are created, and collaborate with your team. The next step in building a culture of documentation on your team or your company is to build a system of accountability, right? So one thing I do with the teams I work with is I usually create a spreadsheet where I have all the reports or projects, and I have a column that lists, the stakeholders, the analysts involved, the author, the description of the project or report. And then at the end, I have a column that says, has this been documented or not, right? So this is very important because it helps me understand what our competencies currently are as far as written documentation, but it also provides a benchmark for the analysts or the people who are managing and so forth. And it's a chance for us to review, not just review what needs to be documented, but also to see if any documents that have already been created need to be refreshed. Remember, I told you that document technology is changing at a fast pace. So you have to constantly review these documents to see they need to be refreshed. So again, create a system of accountability. That's another step to building a culture of documentation. The next step in building a culture of documentation and making this a standard process in your company or team is to create a repository, right? And that can be accessed by all the stakeholders involved with your project, right? So if your company has a server, right, that's where a lot of people save their documentation. Make sure it's in a folder that the key stakeholders can access for information. And there are tools out there as well that can also facilitate this process, right? There are tools like, SharePoint is a good example. The Dropbox has another tool that can be used. There's another tool called Basecamp that also works for this purpose. There are a whole bunch of documentation repository tools out there and project management tools. And if you're not using one, I highly recommend you invest in one to help create efficiencies in your business and get your teammates on board to using it and standardize the process. And again, remember what I said, it requires proactive management leadership. You can't just say to people, hey, put your things there and then walk away. You have to be involved with them all the time to make sure they buy into your vision and the process, okay? So again, next step is creating a repository where all your documents can live and where they can be easily accessed. And that's about it as far as how to establish a culture of documentation. Again, this is a very basic, or should I say, more process-focused conversation. There are a lot of more technical details we can get into, but this is just to establish a culture of documentation if you don't have one at all in your company, team, or organization, right? So remember, the highlights of everything we discussed is that documentation is an ongoing process. That's very important to remember. And a lot of people kind of fall off the bandwagon, right? It involves, identifying what projects or reports need to be documented. That's step one. Finding a home for these documents, right? After they've been documented, so storing them, reviewing them, and then starting the process all over again, right? Documenting the projects or reports, storing them, creating a good home for them, reviewing them, and documenting. Documenting, store, review. Document, store, review. Document, store, review. It's very important to build this culture if you want to see operational efficiencies, if you want to mitigate and reduce risk in your company, and if you want to improve and add value to your bottom line. Having a culture of documentation is extremely important. I hope this conversation was helpful to you. Again, I'm just sharing my experience. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment below. Maybe you're a manager or a leader and you have some different thoughts on documentation. I'm always open to learn and grow. So please share your thoughts on how you have built a culture of documentation, or if you found something valuable with what I said, let me know in the comments below. And please subscribe to this channel, Hickham's Dixon. Please subscribe, hit the subscribe button, subscribe. Again, I hope this conversation provided value for you. My name is Ben. This is Hickham's Dixon, and I will see you soon. Peace.